So today we are going to do a quick and dirty, well, I don't necessarily know how quick it's going to be, but it's going to be a dirty history on the beginning of Amtrak, some of its early existence, and brief overview of like what I would have done and how things, at least I think, would have turned out over the years, with a bunch of caveats. So yeah, again, background, Amtrak, the legislation, early days, health history. There's actually a big warning for that. So the actually pedantry warning. I know the code name is Railpacks. I'm calling it Amtrak all the way through this. If that's going to bother you, you can kindly stop watching. So background information on passenger trains. Peak frequencies was 1929 at around 20,000 train trips per year, 10,000 of which carried mail, which includes first class trains like Daylights that had names all the way down to your fourth class fast mails. The other half didn't. Thing that people like saying that, oh, it was all trains, and it's about half at their peak. So this is the chart of passenger miles versus total miles, or per capita versus total. This is not a direct relation to like number of people taking trains, because like with how the math of this works out, technically more people rode trains here than here. There's just more of a volume. Long story short, without getting into like too detailed of this, also as explained on the slide. You got to divide these two numbers to get the total ridership. So what you have here is fewer people taking people taking fewer longer trips versus people here taking. You have more people taking shorter trips. Um, Also, so like this like dip right here, right after the war, also is like more people and more trips in during the war, just because more people, shorter trips, more people. Math divides itself out that way. But in total, like number of like amount of like passenger miles traveled, it would have been the peak is the war, but the number of like volume of like people is the peaks are before and after, and then dropped and trailed off here. So between 1958 and 1970, background information, we passed a Transportation Act under the Eisenhower administration in 1958. It had been passed because between 1946 and 1957, the U.S. had lost $7 billion in passenger or $7 billion in losses on from passenger trains, and that's not $7 billion in 2025 money. That is $7 billion in like back then money, um, which is a lot more than it is now. And 723 million of that loss was in 1957 alone. And this led to the Doyle report that said passenger trains were damaging the health of America's railroads, and thorough analysis would be needed to determine what the future was going to be for them. And this was before the dark days of the late 1960s when we had the Penn Central blowing up on our faces and all that collapsing. Part of this also led to the creation of the Section 13A cancellations, which put cancellations under the federal government, not state government, and allowed branch line services and a lot of secondary mainline services to get canceled in the basically from the launch of the 707 through to basically the beginning of Amtrak. The Doyle report came out and said that passenger trains were damaging the health of the railroads. That they'd have to do market analysis and what, if anything, they determined to be profitable under this report would be nationalized. And this was in their plan in 1961. And then this was followed up by the Hosmer report. In the meantime, in between the Hosmer report and the Doyle report, the Northeastern Railroad started going bankrupt, specifically the New Haven and the Central New Jersey. Penn Central formed, the mail contracts got canceled. So the Hosmer report analyzed the finances of 8 railroads. For every dollar in passenger revenue they received, they lost $1.83. The Senate Commerce Committee started having hearings on how to bail out the railroads in 1969. And by bailout, this would have been just taking over the passenger trains or at least subsidizing them. So there were about 7 options that ended up boiling out of these discussions and eventual Senate debates. So option 1 was nationalize the passenger trains with a corporate structure TBD, at least at the time of debating it in 1969. Another option was that they would buy the rolling stock and rehabilitate it and then rent it back to the railroads to run the trains because rolling stock was becoming an expensive problem. Option 3 was unlimited subsidies to the existing railroads. Option 4 was expanding Section 13A cancellations to basically let them cancel everything. Step 5 was do nothing, or option 5 was do nothing. The thing Congress is really good at doing. Option 6 was banning cancellations, and then option 7 was the 18 corridor P3 proposal, which we'll get into that one later. So what did the DOT determine? In 1968, the DOT determined that the Northeast Corridor, or at least what it is the Northeast Corridor now, was worth preserving, and maybe some of the other routes around the country, and all the long-distance services were expendable. They determined that whatever the structure, one national entity should take over, and full recommendations would be coming out in the end of year 1969. So the DOT recommendations, they were debating over roadbed and rolling stock rehabilitation, 50-50 matching funds to states to set up and run corridors, and creating a corporation to run a basic network with the ability to cancel unprofitable routes after some amount of time. So Johnson decides not to run again. Nixon gets elected. So debate slowed down temporarily while this transition happened. Nixon appointed former Massachusetts Governor John Volpe as the DOT secretary. He was a former Federal Highway Administration official, and he took the DOT's ideas and eventually submitted a bill to the OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, which wasn't technically called that till I think 71. It was a different name, but we're also just going, same thing with me, not calling it rail packs all the way through this until historically I'm calling it OMB because that's what we know it as now. It's a deal. The Nixon administration balked. The administration didn't want to spend $40 million to get Amtrak off the ground, and they thought the DOT's analysis didn't support creating Amtrak. And at this point, the Senate, the press, and the Penn Central were hounding the admin to do something. But this initial proposal from Volpe never went to the Senate. This is John Volpe here. So eventually the Senate started getting itself together. So the Senate Commerce Committee chair was Warren Magnuson, who wrote a bill combining various elements of the various things that were being debated at the time, which was that the DOT designates a basic system and service level, the federal government would own and rehabilitate rolling stock, and possibly unlimited subsidies in the meantime and thereafter. So the response to this was Nixon losing his goddamn mind, or at least his OMB person. They didn't want to spend $435 million per year to subsidize the railroads, which is $3.75 billion in subsidies today, like in 2025 money. So the Senate proposed the Unlimited Subsidies Act and a draft of the Amtrak Act and a draft from the administration for Amtrak. The Subsidy Act was the only one that got out of committee, and the admin's Amtrak Act failed. So the dumpster fire continued, and Nixon threatened to veto the Subsidy Act, so it never went to the floor. And at this time, Senators Pell and Kennedy from Massachusetts proposed the 18 Corridor P3 bill as an alternative to Amtrak. Gonna complain a lot about that in the health history section. So if you want to hear that, I guess you can wait, but we'll get into this. What it was, the brief overview was not technically a P3, but the spiritual prototype of a P3, because a P3 at this point in history I don't think was fully defined as a thing yet. So I'm using P3 as kind of a holdout because it was a prototype of a P3 that we would know and love today. Or I guess hate if you're me. 15 regions were designated, although they wanted 18. The DOT would write a business plan for all of them and then submit that to Congress and the states for funding, and each region would be a separate corporation. This is my best interpretation of what this map would have looked like. There are a lot of problems with this map that I don't like. Namely because in this entire thing, a part of the Northeast Corridor, they do not even mention Harrisburg, Allentown, a connection to Pittsburgh. That entire part of Pennsylvania is just completely ignored. I'm not from that part of the country, so I don't know if Boston deeply hates Pennsylvania for some reason. I don't know. But yeah, and also the gray ones, if you can see them, are the ones that I kind of filled in and would guess would be a region. I'm guessing the seaboard part of the South would be different than the more Piedmont region of the South, for the sake of arguing. If you want to pause and look at this map, we're not getting too long into this because this didn't really go too far. Also, no long distance services probably. What inevitably failed was that the DOT said no. They determined that Amtrak was the only way forward. They needed one national carrier, not 18 regional ones, and the long distance routes being kicked to to be determined in the future kind of deal. They also didn't want to deal with administering that many companies. The Senate basically said we're doing nationalization or subsidies, and subsidies were already rejected. The railroad said we don't have time to wait for this. We don't have 2 to 1 every years for studies. The Penn Central came back and said we're literally and physically and financially coming apart at the seams. And it went to the House for debate anyways. Love our politics. You know, it was one of those times when I think corruption probably would have done us a favor. So the House debating this bill. The House debated the P3 bill and an Amtrak bill from the Senate. The AAR, the unions, and the DOT made recommendations to the Amtrak bill, and they passed it to the Senate before the summer recess and the midterms. And they would assume that Nixon would have to eat it on this because in between the Senate starting to take up the debate on Amtrak and this getting through Congress, Penn Central imploded, which biggest bankruptcy until Enron in like '01, and is still like the eighth biggest bankruptcy in American history as of 2025. So yeah, colossal ramifications here. Like this is like on like the Penn Central blowing up on its own. It was like on par, basically a recession level event for the American economy. Nixon continued to lose his goddamn mind, though. The House had increased the capital funding and the loans. Nixon threatened to impound the money, which meant he wouldn't have spent it and would have limited it to the initial Senate proposal. Um, Passed the House by a huge margin, and then it was passed through the Senate on unanimous consent in October of 1970. And then Nixon signed it ahead of the 1970 midterms. But why? So Volt pleaded his case to Nixon. He said that the losses would go from 30 million in the first year to profitable in years 4 or 5. And he was also friends with Nixon's secretary, who hated Nixon's inner circle, who had been like a pain in the ass throughout this whole process. And Volk could get some off the record time with Nixon that other people couldn't. He also said this would lose the Republicans a few Senate seats, and that Volk's credibility with Congress would be, shot if this was vetoed. So again, the dumpster fire continuing. Also, at this point, I should note that like some railroads blame passenger trains for all the damage on the rails at this point, which is also another way they like were cooking the books to make these look bad. Basically, all the damage from the coal trains were blamed on the passenger trains, financially speaking, as a way to like, induce getting rid of them, and also for interfering with freight schedules, which is ironic considering my Comcast technician has a more consistent schedule than a freight train does today. Thank you, PSR. So this would have been this. Anyways, my gripes aside, this is the startup timeline for Amtrak. So the act was signed on October 30th, 1970. By November 30th, the basic system map and service levels were due to Congress and the ICC. They would have until the 30th to give their feedback. And then a final map was due on January 29th, 1971 to Congress and the DOT, which was binding and had no recourse. May 1st is when Amtrak took over, and on 4 years later, they could start canceling routes. So initial corridor services, 2 round trips a day, 3 men on an increased plan. So there was a New York-Boston, so the Northeast Corridor for these first 2, New York-Buffalo, the Empire Corridor, Pennsylvanian, Chicago-Cleveland service, a thing we still don't even want, Chicago-St. Louis, a Lincoln service, the Borealis, 2 or 3 times a day, depending on which plan they went with, Chicago-Cincinnati, not a thing we have today besides the Cardinal, Cincinnati-Detroit, thing we still haven't even guessed wanted, Cincinnati to Cleveland, pretty obvious, LA-San Diego, and then Seattle-Portland. Long distance routes. So New York-Chicago, New York-St. Louis, New York-Miami, New York-New Orleans, Chicago-Miami, Chicago-New Orleans, Chicago-LA, Chicago-San Francisco, Chicago-Seattle, Chicago-Houston, Washington-Chicago, Washington-St. Louis, LA-Portland, and LA-New Orleans. So it's weird because I think the initial plan was that it was just going to go, the Starlight was going to stop in Portland and they were going to do like the through car shuffle they did with the pool service. That ended up not happening. It just got fully extended into Seattle, and we have the Starlight we know and love today. As to why that was Portland and not Seattle. Basic schematic of what the map would have looked like. These check mark lines are the corridor services. The long thin lines were the long distance services. These were the various service levels that the OMB demanded be made, showing various levels of profitability compared to what Volt wanted. And then this is the map that went to the ICC. The dark lines are what the OMB was willing to put up with, and then the checked lines are the lines that the ICC mandated to go back. These more bold lines were required. These less bold, thin lines were recommended but not required. And I think the only one that actually got through, well, two of these got through, was this guy here, the Kansas City St. Louis, and then the Norfolk into Cincinnati. I think were the only two that out of this that actually survived. Um, Upstate New York service became 403B services, which we'll get into what that was in a minute. And then after this, they had to get McKinsey to look through the maps to decide where were the trains going to go, and these were the various options they had based on current for 1970 service levels. And then this led to Amtrak. By the way, this is a 1974 map because the initial map didn't have North Coast Limited on it. The San Joaquin came a couple years in as a 403B route. There's also a couple other differences, like the Southern Railway not joining, but still having some of its services skipping around. There not being a train through upstate New York into Ohio and Chicago. That got added later as Electro Limited. But yeah, this is like a long, dirty story about how we got to here. So changes that happened in the meantime, in between like the act getting passed and the trains actually coming into fruition. Nixon's OMB wanted less than what Volpe wanted. The ICC said no to them. McKinsey filtered through the railroad maps to set up the network. They decided at some point to change the name from Railpax to Amtrak. And then the public was annoyed at some of these announcements because their services were getting axed. The public was referred to their states to fund Section 403B trains, which was a provision in the Amtrak Act that allowed states to sponsor trains that Amtrak would partially fund and possibly incorporate into the basic network. States also had to kick in money too. Most of the state-supported routes were started this way. There are exceptions to this rule, so it's not like one and done. But most of the state-supported services these days that are existing now started as 403B trains. This process was eliminated in 2008. And so service levels, this is what the corridor services would have looked like as like on a more, I don't know, a better looking map than the schematic one made by Volpe. So what Volpe wanted was 124 round individual trains a day. The expanded map, I think, was 135. I'm assuming these are individual trips. They might be round trips. I don't know. The thing wasn't very clear, but assuming trips. Volpe plus what actually happened would have been somewhere between 180 and 200 trains a day, so about 2/3 of what Amtrak is now. So initial funding, Amtrak was essentially it was going to be it was meant to die quickly. It was not it was a laster off for the trains. It wasn't really let's bail them out. It was bail them out to let it die. $40 million in capital grants and $60 million in loan guarantees, which is what Nixon was going to allow to be spent. The amount in the act was different, and that took some time to eventually shake out of Congress. The railroads had to pay 150% of their last year's loss to Amtrak. I believe they had 3 years to do that, and it had to be payable in equipment, services rendered, or track access. So, first few years was a mess, to put it nicely. It was assumed by Nixon and some of the railroads that they'd just run out of money and the trains would all just get canceled. And he picked Roger Lewis, who was a friendly guy but very inexperienced with railroads, to run Amtrak, and he ran it just like Nixon wanted, which was straight into the ground. The initial capital grant was used to remodel the cars but not do heavy maintenance. And due to them already being abused by their former owners in the old railroads, 20 to 25% of the fleet was out of service within 18 months. This led to the Senate Commerce Committee pushing the board to fire Lewis and replacing him with Paul Reistrup, who was a man who actually did have experience running a railroad and being like a railroad guy. And he got a heavy maintenance program off the ground, and along with the money to actually do this, so the trains wouldn't be as much of a mess. And he also ran additional funding out of Congress to get the first round of superliners and amphitheats procured. There were a few reasons that by this point Congress was able to exert power over Amtrak and just over the Nixon administration generally, at least in the context of Amtrak. By 1972, the equipment had broken down like crazy despite all the remodels. So imagine like walking into like a brand new used 1950s train, and like you can't flush the toilets. Like it was that bad. And also, this was after '73, which is like post Watergate, post oil crisis. So Amtrak was popular and not controversial at that point. I don't get why it has become now, besides stupid culture war crap. And Nixon couldn't afford to look worse by vetoing funding for something that was like seen as reasonably not controversial. And then again, after the oil crisis, Amtrak was seen as more of a lifesaver despite all of its compounding problems. So putting money into it to make it less of a dumpster fire was like a smart idea, and the public was fine with it. And then this is like the initial fleet level from 1972. So they inherited like all these baggage cars, baggage dorms, a bunch of 10-6 sleepers, a crap load of other sleepers, slumber coaches, diners, lounges, coaches, dome sleepers, dome coaches, and all this crap, and 3 turbo trains. By 1990, after they had rehabbed the inherited fleets to the heritage fleets, it was about 633 cars. Um, Different video as to why this is a pain in the butt, but we'll talk about that in a different day. And this is end of history. Speculation is next. So the open speculation and what I would have done, second guessing Monday morning quarterbacking. So even in all of this, I'm still going to assume some things stay the same, like expecting Nixon to sabotage things and expect Amtrak to fail. Roger Lewis getting appointed and running it into the ground, and then Paul Reistrup. Politics happening at the same pace, same startup date, and the railroad industry history staying the same. Like I'm talking about like nudges and changing some stuff, and some stuff changing like with a nudge, not necessarily like I'm shooting the infinite power of Christ at history and changing things that I would think could be doable if the politics shook out a little differently. Would be Congress limiting what the OMB can do to the basic system, more requirements on what the basic system is, and requiring the 1815 P3 network to be planned and get some initial service, with them being Amtrak requiring a capitalization plan to Congress by 1975. So increasing congressional oversight. Main thing I would do is having requiring that the DOT come up with their 5 options and maintaining the status quo. So 6, submitting them to the House and Senate Commerce Committees and letting them agree upon which map and service level to go with, which was the currently profitable, near profitable, above near profitable, Volp's recommendation, and the recommended plus. Basically just to minimize the OMB saying like, no, we're not doing this, which again would have caused some fight between the president and Congress. But I mean, again, we have the ability of hindsight to know that Nixon was assumed to be on the ropes, so I can say this. Anyways, it would change the startup timeline, so you'd have the DOT, Congress, ICC, and state DOT's final submission timeline as follows. So you have 30 days for the DOT to get it together, 10 days for Congress to make its election, like 30 something days for the ICC and the states to do their 403B submission, and then the last 2 weeks to get the finalized map, and it'd be like 2 days later than the current proposal took to get. So this is like again my thought on what the regional networks would be. Still forgot to like reconnect Harrisburg, and on this, I'm sorry if you care about people who live in Harrisburg. Regional networks. This is what it looked like, or this isn't what it looks like. I mean, there was no map. This was not a plan. Why this network? Again, par bakes, half measure to forestall something better from happening and only protecting the Northeast corridor. Reasons why, when it comes to public transportation planning, at least vis-a-vis Amtrak, I'm not a fan of people in the Northeast. I'm just going to say that. And I don't live in the Northeast. I live in Georgia. I've lived in the West Coast before this. Very much as a, screw you, I got mine kind of situation some of the time, especially with Mr. Ted Kennedy. No disrespect on you, but just total disrespect on your politicians. Just gonna say the politicians and me don't get along, or at least wouldn't if they cared who I was. Like also, like I said, this thing didn't even mention Harrisburg or Allentown or connecting to Pittsburgh, and assuming that there's a 50% federal funding and Amtrak can just use the money like on its own, which it really should problems I have with modern Amtrak and Congress, and not the scope of this video. I don't expect the states to kick in much. And also, the southern portions of the network would be hit the worst, since the Southern Railway not joining Amtrak until '79 could honestly scuttle the whole thing. And again, if Amtrak could use its own federal portion, it would have been done again post '79, um, under the shadow of Carter not liking trains and Reagan just being hostile to the public sector. And not to mention, you're dealing with Malaise era inflation on top of it. So, assuming that they still had to do some sort of planning, we'll do a little red light, green light on what network I think, at least for the corridor services, um, that would have popped out. So, green light, the green lines are planned by Volp, mandated by the ICC, or 403B submissions that got off the ground mostly before 1985, which, as you can tell, is a lot of the Midwest, is a good chunk of the Northeast. The yellow routes are routes that would have been planned under the 18 corridor P3, that I think would have gotten off the ground. Nothing in Colorado or Utah, just because even if I threw a map, not a map, even if I threw routes there, I'm assuming that because of the Rio Grande not joining, it probably would have been scuttled and then just never have happened. Because the Rio Grande, I think, joined in '85, joined Amtrak, or '84 or '85. Um, and I'm assuming that just would have kept anything happening, and I'm assuming the money would have been redirected at some point, before 1985. And then red light is stuff I could see happening eventually, but probably not. Again, the whole southern network here being I think, I mean, obviously this would be good to have now, um, even if these trains only ran twice, 2 or 3 times a day round trips. Um, I still even though this the Seaboard route was still on the Seaboard system, which did join Amtrak. I have a seriously difficult time thinking it would have gotten off the ground if you didn't have access to Atlanta or Charlotte. Um, that's the reason why I don't think it would have happened in the South. I also think that again, these Kansas Oklahoma routes up to Tulsa probably would have happened, if they were forced to. Uh, Kansas City South, I don't think would have happened. Definitely not into Fort Smith, at least not initially. But I do think the rest of these routes could have gotten off the ground. Also, the services in California should have happened a long time ago, but that is a different video. So I'm assuming 500 million per network, 9 billion total, 15 defined regions, 3 left in the air. And does this mean Metroliners between Kansas City and Dallas in 2020? Hell no. It's still Eisenhower's America, or depending on the exact period of history, Reagan's. Again, I'm kind of losing track of my exact history, period in history, and exact generational turnover. But either way, this is still the land of Eisenhower's America or Reagan's America. So either we love cars or we hate the public sector in America at this point. Also, if you don't know what the Malaise era was, it was the period from roughly the '73 oil crisis through the recession of 1982. Very brief recession, relatively speaking. Period of very high inflation, very high interest rates, and a very stagnant economy. Kind of like the post-pandemic economy we're currently slumming through right now. And from 1975 to 1982, the dollar lost roughly 47% of its value. So the $500 million of 1975 was worth 265 million by 1982, when at least the Southern network would have been able to start really getting in gear and being constructed. And then the issues due to history, you're still gonna have Nixon trying to sabotage everything for the time he's in. Ford's administration being a 3-year dumpster fire effectively, and then again Carter not liking trains, and then Reagan not liking the public sector. Basically, Amtrak was not really going to catch any breaks until maybe the '90s, even if it got money initially. So I'm not assuming oh yeah, this is going to be the bright and prosperous future. This is more of all Amtrak is bigger and still stagnated out at some point future. And again, you still have the Malaise era, the oil crises. You still have the railroads being a mess in the '70s. Not all of them, but a lot of them being a mess. Eventually, Conrail getting built. a lot of mergers happening, a lot of mergers also going sideways because, that was a pain in the butt. Remembering having to live through a lot of delayed trains as a kid when the SP and UP merged. Um, Two railroads not joining would hinder at least two regions, if not four. And yeah, so there's still going to be like a lot of reasons that could mess this up. Long distance map. This is like what I would roughly expect the long distance map to look like. So kind of like what it is today and was with more service in the past. Pause if you'd like to look. I also didn't really like break this out by route to kind of break down more by endpoint. So fleet size, I imagine an AM fleet for the Northeast being 495, so basically its current fleet. AM fleet ones for elsewhere about 1,200, assuming a bigger, like the most expansive I would expect. Superliner ones, a little over 1,000. A corridor version of a Superliner, so basically the modern California cars, 660, probably mostly scattered on the West Coast. And then Viewliners at 825, which is a 4,230-ish cars. This is a maximum extent, not a minimum that I'd expect. And Amtrak inherited roughly a third of that at its creation, and there was roughly a little less than that one, like right before Amtrak was created. So we'd roughly end up with like a network that would be, at least in terms of number of trains, about as dense as it would have been in like the mid 60s before the mail contracts all got canceled, but like not not as weird as those network. Like that's also another video I guess I could make, is like why the network, air quotes, like Pastor Network wasn't really a network before Amtrak, because I don't. That one actually would be a video where I would talk some crap about people and like their things, but I don't want to go there yet. Um, Anywho, so it's like basically it's like you'd have like the same level of service as like the mid 60s, but like on a more focused and coordinated network rather than the like various cartels or railroads competing against each other nominally. Yeah, long distance route changes. Sorry, wrong slide, wrong place. So restoring the Southern after the Southern Railway joins. That's the one that goes on the more southerly route out of Atlanta. More coherent Desert Wind Pioneer routing that's running independently of the Zephyr. And then DC getting its own St. Louis route instead of just being in a section of the National Limited. And hopefully more of the network holding itself together as time goes on with more equipment and congressional supports. Even if it wasn't like initially like something that was wanted. So struggles moving forward after all this. The main struggle is going to be them being these three politicians here. Being, does this lead to self-sufficiency, which was the question that ruled Amtrak's first 20 years of existence. Less so now, and people will still argue that that is the only thing now. It's less. It's not as bad as it used to be. People would still want to privatize Amtrak. Like there were literally attempts at privatizing Amtrak at least once in the last 25 years, and some other finagling since then. Um, it's gotten less intense. I mean, at least in my lifetime. I mean, I'm in my 30s. Because of the war on terror and the rising gas prices, it made Amtrak seem more useful. And like honestly, with the Mardi Gras and the Borealis coming online and being extremely successful, just shows how much demand there is for this. Also, the 750-mile rule being implemented in '08 was another thing that would have possibly come to screw this up. Also, this is the time where we talk about the network growth strategy. Um, this is the a map, not the only map. So what? So it's the parallel Zephyr route, CoStar Light routes, Southwest Limited or Southwest Chief route, and Sunset Limited route were not planned as part of the network growth strategy. It's just what I'm throwing in because that's what would make this system make more sense. And also the weird like dog leg through Texas is there because they were going to do basically a weird dog leg like this with the Sunset Limited and Texas Eagle and I think some other train. They were going to do some like weird dog legging through Texas and like the Texas Triangle. Having just one train deal with this like weird little loop would just been easier, and this is just what I'm assuming would have happened. But they also would have had like a connecting train between San Antonio and Laredo, the Fort Worth to New Washington train along the southern route. They're also proposing a Florida to Boston service, And then all of these like routes from like Newark and Philadelphia into Chicago, which would have added a whole 4 trains to that routing, with one of them going through Canada and into Detroit. And then one of these trains is actually just a Philadelphia Chicago route that ran overnight, or at least was planned. That one, I think, was the one that got the closest to like actually happening, along with the I think they're going to call it the Crescent Star to Dallas Fort Worth area. And then the train to Madison and Louisville, that actually did get off the ground, but didn't last long. And then they also were going to do a train all the way out to Des Moines, which also never got off the ground. Anyways, if they actually did the network growth strategy, my bare minimum would of equipment they would have needed on top of this was about 450 Superliner twos to just run the trains, about 390 Viewliner twos, 840 cars total. Not counting any potential state support in this, or the possibility of there being like a corridor Viewliner variant to supplement the Acela rebranding of the Northeast in the late 90s. And it would take 600-ish to 750-ish to cover the Acela Regional, the Acela Keystone, the Acela Empire Corridor South, and the Acela Valley Flyer, the Acela Springfield Service, and the Acela Clocker, or whatever the hell they were going to rename Acela everything to at that point in history. Again, there's like another video that I either have or will make that will go more detail into like Amtrak's fleet management. Oh my god, Amtrak's fleet management is like annoying and depressing, and the people who talk about like there's some sort of like logic to it. That there just isn't, that this hasn't just been like a roving dumpster fire through a good chunk of its history is also just kind of amazing. Between like Amtrak's management and Congress and the executive, like this is like a triangular dumpster fire. It's not just like all Amtrak's fault or all Congress or all the presidency. These three are tangoing with each other. Initiatives that would have been likely moving forward. As I said, this isn't like a golden age of path. Well, I mean golden age relative to what we have, but like I would expect it basically to be like we're gonna get like a bigger Amtrak, more state supported service equivalents, and then it just stagnate probably in the 90s. Because again, this is still a U.S. run by the baby boomers and the greatest generation, and they're still like we're more car friendly than drain friendly. Um, so again, if there was going to be any major expansions beyond like long distance trains after like I'd say honestly the early 80s, I would imagine. And the early 80s, I'm just saying it'd be like on fumes from like the 70s with my like outrageous plan. Um, and anything after that, like in the 90s, would just be state level initiatives, I'd imagine, until probably now. There was also a proposed 1 cent gas tax in 1991, which ended up not happening because it was George H.W. Bush's reelection year. And yeah, that never happened because again, he lost reelection. And there was also the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which could have possibly put some funding for expansion into like state level services for air pollution reduction reasons. Because I know now living in Atlanta, like in the 90s, there was like a huge slowdown, at least in Georgia, of highways during the 90s due to air pollution, and some improvements to MARTA at that point, which is like the last major expansions to MARTA happened because of air pollution reasons. Um, but that would have been like I guess the last hurrah of expansion basically until now in the 2020s, assuming we got anything better. And rolling back to that map, like with most of these services, I'm expecting like between 2 and 5 trains a day. Like I'm not expecting it to be like a huge amount of service. Like it's gonna be somewhere between like the current San Joaquin schedule, I guess Gold Runner now, or to like the like what is it, the Illinois Zephyr that runs down to like Quincy, like somewhere in that like level of frequencies. Like even though like some of these routes wouldn't make sense with like a near hourly or hourly service, like I don't expect that to happen in the 70s. Like again, like if we did get like the Capital Corridor of a 1973 version, I still excited to like top out at like maybe the frequency of the Hiawatha, which is 7 round trips a day, and I think maybe 9 if you include the buses. Um, so again, like we're not talking like huge expansion. Like we're not talking like, oh yeah, it's Europe. We can like get on a train that leaves every 30 seconds. It's not. We're not going there. It's still America. It's still the boomers. It's still the greatest generation. It's still Eisenhower. Anyways, I'm gonna leave that here. Um, yeah, don't know if I'll make more. If there's a Discord link, you can harass me and the others. Oh well. See you in the next one, maybe.